All right, we are picking up in the chapter 12, and I'm going to reread that little bit, last line right there. I might read that last paragraph because it's such a big thing. So just a reminder, we are the landmark history of the American people, and we're reading the final bit of chapter 12 in this. So we are ending the Civil War. Lee has surrendered, and we are choosing between how to deal with the South. We have the Wade Davis plan by the radical Republicans, and we have Lincoln's plan, which was like, that's, Lincoln's plan was just the 1/10 of the people had to take an oath to support the Constitution to have their state rights back. And so in order to avoid that big clash with the radical Republicans, head-on clash, he went to the Congress and said, this is what we're going to do. We're going to let the states vote. They can either choose my way or they can choose your way. And of course, all the southern states chose President Lincoln's way. And so then after that, 1 week following Lee's surrender to Grant, President Lincoln was in Ford's Theater attending a play when a unstable actor named John Wilkes Booth snuck quietly into Lincoln's box and then shot him in the back of the head. And that is the day that President Lincoln died the next day. So we cannot be sure what would have happened if Lincoln had lived. But we do know that Lincoln's combination of qualities was extremely rare. He was, of course, a strong man who would fight for what he believed. Yet he was also a simple, gentle man who understood other people. And most important for a president, he was a clever politician. He knew how to give up less important things in order to persuade people to support him on what was more important. Andrew Johnson, so we can see him here, the new president, was in many ways like Lincoln. With no schooling, he began as a poor tailor. He too was a self-made man. Like Lincoln, he had been born in the South, and though he came from Tennessee, he had been against the secession. When he was the Democrat senator for Tennessee, he was the only Southerner senator to support the Union after the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. Still, in some important ways, Johnson was no Lincoln. He was not good at persuading. He did not know how to use a joke to make a serious point. Just as Lincoln was gentle, generous, and compromising, so Johnson was crude and obstinate. His weakness would not have been serious in an ordinary citizen, but they were disastrous in a president. Congress was not in session when Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Many Republicans distrusted Johnson because he had been a Democrat. They had added him to the Republican ticket as their candidate for vice president in 1864 in the hope that he might draw the seceded states back into the Union. Now, when the death of Lincoln had brought Johnson to the White House, the radical Republicans wanted President Johnson to call Congress into special session to make new rules for the South. But he refused. President Johnson would follow the rules already declared by Lincoln, and he alone would decide when the Southern states had satisfied Lincoln's requirements so they could govern themselves. Lincoln's requirements were not too hard for the Southern states to satisfy. By December 1865, when President Johnson made his first report to Congress, all but one of the old Confederate states had done what Lincoln asked for. The lone exception, Texas, soon came along. Each of these now had its own government in working order. President Johnson reported happily that the Union was restored. But when the congressmen from these southern states came to take their seats in Congress, the radical Republicans shut them out. The radicals controlled the House of Representatives and told them that they were not really congressmen at all, because the southern states were not really states at all. Even if the Confederate states had followed the president's rules, the radicals said the president had no power to make the rules, only Congress, which they meant, of course, the radical Republicans themselves, because remember, the radical Republicans were in control of the House. Their punishing bill, the Wade Davis bill, had declared what Congress wanted. The South would have to be restored by Congress or not at all. Congress set up its own committee on Reconstruction to make its own plan. Radical Avenger Thaddeus Stevens led the committee. The watchword of Stevens' congressional plan: force. The South, he said, was a conquered province, and nobody would be allowed to forget it. Northern troops would be sent to occupy the South. The committee divided the old Confederacy into 5 military districts. Okay, this is getting into interesting stuff, okay? So, we have Congress, the radical Republicans who are in control. They're upset because Andrew Johnson is saying, all right, they've satisfied the requirements to be back in the House of Representatives and the Senate. We think they should be back. And Thaddeus Stevens he's saying, no, it's not your choice. It's the Congress's choice. And since we control it, that's not what we're going to do. So what do? They set up their own committee of Reconstruction, right? And so we're going to start seeing how this committee is going to change things. So his word is force. So the South, he said, was a conquered province, and nobody would be allowed to forget it. Northern troops would be sent to occupy the South. The committee divided the old Confederacy into 5 military districts. The boundaries of the 11 seceded states were not to be ruled. Each of the 5 districts would be ruled by a Northern general. The Northern radical Republicans in Congress laid down the new rules for building new Southern states. They wished to see the new states designed to keep political control in Republican hands. All right, so they are now making rules, right? So they're saying that the South is to be ruled by Northern generals. They've separated into 5 districts. Okay, so some of the radical demands, such as abolishing slavery and giving civil rights to blacks, were just and necessary, but others were not. Worst of all was the radicals' refusal to forgive. They denied many leading citizens in the Old South the right to vote or even to work at their regular jobs. Hungry for power, the radicals wanted to rule the South through a small group of their puppets, and they were anxious to hold the Republican majority in Congress. They were afraid the new Southern congressmen might be against them. Although the radicals said they loved liberty, they were really afraid of it. They were afraid to give political liberty to their old enemies. So what did President Johnson do? Well, under the Constitution, he was supposed to enforce the laws of Congress. Though he believed some of their laws were unwise, he tried to enforce them. But the radicals were out to get Johnson. They could not bear the idea that they might not be able to control the president. So they passed laws that took away powers the Constitution had given the president. For example, the Constitution made the president the commander-in-chief of the army, but the radicals passed a Command of the Army Act that took away his power to command. Interesting. They were obviously spoiling for a fight. They were hoping to tease the president into violating some law that would give them an excuse to have him removed from office. They hoped that then they could seize the powers of the president. But Johnson was careful to obey every law, to follow all the instructions of Congress. Still, there was a limit to his patience. When the radicals passed the Tenure of Office Act, which took away the president's control over his own cabinet, Johnson had decided they had gone too far. So that's interesting. So now they're passing this Tenure of Office Act. So President Johnson can't even choose or have control over his own cabinet. So Johnson had inherited Secretary of War Stanton from Lincoln, but Stanton had become Johnson's enemy and was actually plotting against him. So the president fired Stanton. The Tenure of Office Act said Johnson didn't have authority to do such a thing. Meanwhile, believed such a limitation was against the Constitution. In the total scope of things, Stanton's firing was small, but it was big enough to give the radicals an opportunity, and they took it. So the Tenure Office of Act said that Johnson had no control over his cabinet. And so firing Stanton was against the rules from that Tenure of Office Act. So the framers of the Constitution, being wise men, had provided a way to remove a criminal president. But they saw that if they made it too easy to remove a president, opponents could be tempted to use it to get rid of any president they could not beat at the polls. Then every president would live in terror, afraid to do his duty, for fear some political enemy would make a crime out of it. The Constitution, Article 2, Section 4, says that Congress can remove a president only on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. First, the House of Representatives has to impeach the president. Okay, this means that a majority vote to support a list of accusations. Then the Senate has to try the president. That means to put him on trial. The Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court presides, but the entire Senate must vote. To remove a president, a mere majority of the Senate is not enough. The framers showed their special wisdom when they required a vote of 2/3 of the members present. So when the Senate met on March 30th, 1868, to try President Andrew Johnson on the impeachment brought by the House of Representatives, the nation was in breathless suspense. Few really believed that Andrew Johnson had been guilty of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Johnson was a man of rock-ribbed honesty. No one could prove otherwise. Earnestly, he had followed his inaugural oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Perhaps he had sometimes lost his temper and shown bad judgment, or had used language that a president should not use. But these were not crimes. His only crime had been that he believed in his duty to obey the Constitution, and he was determined to follow a policy of forgiveness. He could not have satisfied the radicals without surrendering all the powers of the presidency into their hands. On May 16, 1868, when the Senate finally voted, 35 senators voted guilty, 19 voted not guilty. Those voting guilty were in a large majority, but they had one less vote than the 2/3 required by the Constitution, and Andrew Johnson remained president. So, it's really important to talk about why the framers of the Constitution made the impeachment process the way they did. And the first reason is because they wanted to make sure it wouldn't be too easy to remove a president. Because obviously we always have different political parties, and people think they're right versus certain parties think they're right over other parties, and they're always trying to be in power, right? And so if somebody got elected and the other political party doesn't agree with them, then if it was too easy to remove that president, then we would constantly be having new presidents, right? Every president would live in fear that if he did something that his political enemy didn't like, they would make it a crime, right? And so what they did was they made this process for impeachment. And what they did was, first, the House of Representatives had to vote to impeach the president, okay? And that had to be a majority vote to support that list of accusations. After they get that majority vote for the list of accusations, and it had to be treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, then it goes to the Senate, where the Senate will put the president on trial, where the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court will preside. But the entire Senate must vote. So in order then, so we've got House of Representatives is voting to impeach him. And then the Senate has to try him. And then the Senate then has to vote. And they require 2/3 vote to be able to impeach him. So they did it because they wanted to make sure that the presidents didn't have to live in fear. So, and then there's just a fun fact. There have been a few presidents that have been impeached. So besides Andrew Johnson, 2 other American presidents have been impeached. Bill Clinton, the 42nd president of the United States, was impeached for perjury and obstruction of justice in December 1998, but the Senate acquitted Clinton in February 1999 by a margin of 17 votes. Donald Trump, the 45th president, went through 2 impeachment trials. He was impeached for abuse of power and obstruction in 2019. The Senate acquitted him in a 53-47 vote. And then Trump was later impeached again for inciting an insurrection in 2021, and he was acquitted 55-43. So that's a lot going on here. One of the biggest things is that President Lincoln has been assassinated because people didn't agree with him. And now we see President Andrew Johnson stepping in, and we see those radical Republicans still really trying to take away the power of the president and basically make it what they want. So they're calling them tyrants when really the radical Republicans are making all these rules and passing new acts to make sure that everybody has to do what they want to do. So with that, we will end and pick back up with chapter 13.